Hello, my name is Luke.
And my name is Piers.
And welcome to On the Gallery Floor, a new contemporary art podcast where artists and audiences get to interview each other.
Yes, artists answer your questions while getting to ask some of their own too.
By bringing you closer to the artist and the artist closer to you, we hope to transform contemporary art's reputation from an inaccessible conundrum to an ordinarily relatable experience for all.
So, get your questions ready and meet us on the gallery floor. In this, our first episode, we're talking to the Irish-born conceptual artist Anne Tallentire, whose exhibition, Material Distance, is currently on show here at the John Hansard Gallery in Southampton. Anne's exhibition makes us think about the spaces we call home and how we use them. Her art reimagines our rooms, houses and cities through surprising encounters with everyday building materials. You'll find drawings made from string, sculptures made from polystyrene. There's even a map of Southampton made from screws and index tags. To experience Anne's exhibition is to rediscover your surroundings and to engage with them in new, creative ways. Material Distance is showing until the 14th of January 2023.
Well, hello Anne. Thank you very much for joining us. And we're here on the gallery floor amongst many of your artworks that we are showing in John Hansard Gallery at the moment. Piers, over to you.
Well, Anne, Luke and I would love to know more about you and the work that you make. So we've got some questions for you, and we hope you've got some questions for us too.
Okay.
Well, let's get to it then. Thank you very much. So, we've had your exhibition here for a little while now, and we've engaged with the public, and we've experienced how they experience the work.
Okay.
So I guess we'll start broad. But what do you want people to think about when viewing your work?
It's very difficult to give a simple answer to that question.
I imagine it is.
Because every single person who comes to see the work will have a very specific and individual response and will think about something that probably relates to them. So in a broad way, I would hope that people would think about their lives in this world in a very broad way. Yeah. And perhaps to be more specific, they might think about the kind of spaces they live in, would like to live in, conditions of living, and things like that.
Just to add to that, do you prefer working around the lived-in rather than the not lived-in places?
Yeah. Not necessarily. As you might know from my first iteration of Outermost, I was looking at derelict sites in Belfast. And I am interested in overlooked spaces, in empty spaces, in forgotten spaces, in liminal spaces, if you like. So not necessarily lived spaces, spaces that maybe people have lived in or potentially could live in. I'm really interested in those kind of spaces. I'm interested in why there are spaces that could be for habitation when they're not for habitation, and the reasons why that might be. I'm also interested in architecture, architecture in relation to living spaces, but also functional spaces for other types of activities other than daily living. So yeah, both, I would say.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you.
And so the next question that we have. So Luke and I think your work is very playful and a little bit cheeky too. Now looking around your exhibition, we can see that objects have been turned from one thing into another. So we want to know how and why do you take recognisable objects like a prison bed, a chair, or any space for that matter, and transform them into an almost unrecognisable new thing made entirely from construction materials?
Well, I think that when you take an object or a material out of its context, its familiar context, and place it in another context, and the gallery, let's face it, is a context for contemplation. And so when you take, or when you put two objects or two materials, two things together, they produce, if you like, a meaning that may not have existed before, or a potential meaning, or a way of thinking about something. So, for example, if you take a piece of tarpaulin and you wrap it around a piece of wood, it might make you think about weather, or it might make you think about the color of the tarpaulin. It might make you think about camping. You know, I mean, who knows what it'll make you think about?
Yeah.
But if you take that tarpaulin, and as I've done, I've placed in two different places in two different works in this exhibition. So it's in a work called Slide, which is a playful work, assemblage work, and it's also in Material Condition, which is a more serious work, which looks at emergency architecture and precarious living.
Well, thank you very much. Well, on to our final question for you, Anne. You've already just mentioned there architects and architecture, and we see that certainly influences your space and your work. In your and social spaces also come into that. And it's clear that you have an interest in those things. So I guess we were just wondering, what made you choose becoming an artist over a profession like an architect?
Well, I wasn't very good at maths. And you have to be very good.
Club.
You have to be very good at maths to be an architect.
Yeah, sure.
I did like geometry, but I wasn't too good at algebra. So, that kind of leaves you a little bit challenged in relation to that profession. But to be quite honest, I wasn't really interested in the way I am now in architecture back when I was making the decision to be an artist. However, I do recognize that the subjects of my work were around lived spaces or unlived spaces and demarcation, either inside or outside, being inside something or outside something. I suppose that's a common thread through a lot of the work.
Yeah, definitely.
So I just don't think I would have cut it as an architect. I wouldn't have, I also feel that the discipline of architecture, the discourse of architecture, is very, very specific and very challenging. I do very much like the way that certain architects think around how buildings could be made more, more user-friendly, if you like. Or I'm very interested in 60s architecture in London.
Would they be more user-friendly than 60s?
Well,
in that way?
There was. I'm thinking specifically of a particular moment when a borough in London, which was Camden, had a very forward-thinking policy in relation to building social housing, and what they wanted was for everybody to have a space with some outdoor space, a living space with some outdoor space. So they built a lot of low-rise, high-density estates. But they also employed very innovative architects to do that. So light floods these spaces.
Right.
They have common areas for communal living and so on. So there were a lot of aspirational ideas within that particular moment in architecture, of which where I live is one.
Do you find that that's something that you don't see more so now, or is that lacking?
Well, I'm not by any means an expert in this field. My observation is that there is much greater awareness of the need for ecologically sustainable living, which I think comes together with an idea of a more beautiful place to live. I don't think those things are separated. So I think that energy saving can be actually employed in a way that makes a space not only functional in a good way, but also very, very beautiful to live in.
Let's push for that then. That would be lovely to have. Anne, thank you very much for answering our questions. Now it's time for the other part, which is where we answer some of yours. And what questions do you have for me and Luke today?
I would be very interested to know what work drew your attention when you first encountered this exhibition. Was there a work or a couple of works that you find yourself looking at? I would love to know.
Well, for me, so my role at the gallery is duty manager, so I oversee front of house. I don't necessarily live with the work in the way that I used to as a gallery assistant.
Yes.
So my approach to work has changed, but I do get to see the work, and there's definitely a specific part of setting out which draws my eye, and that's the gold screws. I'm a bit of a magpie. I see gold. I'm a fan. I don't know what it is. There's just and this comes into another thing that I wanted to talk about at some point potentially. But I used to work in a DIY store. So I'm an ex-colleague of Wick's.
Okay.
So I lived in the screw section, sorting all the screws
Did you?
based on diameter, length.
Oh, wow.
So there was quite a rigorous process of restocking the shelves. So I see your screws that are there, and they're beautiful. I've never seen them.
Do you want me to tell you a little bit
Yes,
about the screws?
if you can, please.
Okay, those screws were bought in the most amazing shop in London in Clerkenwell called Clerkenwell Screws.
Oh, really? Wow.
And it's a very old-fashioned shop. Only takes cash. So it's really, you have to
Wow.
remember that when you arrive. But the owner, I think it's the owner, the person who seems to always be there, is the most knowledgeable person about screws you could find. And when I bought these screws a few years back, and they're actually brass, and he went into great detail about the thread of the screw. And I really wanted a flat head screw.
Yes.
With a line across it, not the, what do you call it when it's
Phillips.
I didn't want it, I wanted the line. And it had to be a certain length and had to be a certain or gauge and so on.
Yeah.
Listening to the owner of that shop speak about screws is listening like somebody doing a PhD Viva examination. I mean, it is amazing.
Yeah.
And he is a joy to go in there. But, you know, I can't get the screws anymore.
Really?
And what you see here and another set in two other iterations, it may herald the end of this work, but I can't go any further with it because those screws are not being made anymore.
Oh, no.
And I think they're handmade in some way, or there's some element of the craft of them,
Yeah.
which I haven't obviously remembered, but I do know that they are, he was very sorry, and he gave me a slightly longer screw the last time, still brass with the same flat head, very burnished, so I had to go home and clean them, but they're too long.
Yeah.
And he was really upset that he couldn't provide me with these precise screws. So that's one thing. And the other small thing is that I have a friend, a very, very good artist, called Adam Chodsko, who you may know of, who, when he first saw this work, wrote me a very nice letter about the work. And he actually talked about the screws and about how really skilled carpenters will always have the threads of the screws running in parallel when they work with them.
And that's why they are
Yes.
all parallel with each other.
I think so.
In the work.
And he had this sort of full appreciation of the quality of these screws. He really got it, and we talked about that. So it's lovely to hear your take of this, and that really pleases me because that's got something to do with your life. That this incidental appearance of these screws has actually, made you think about it.
It was certainly a blast of the past, but
Yeah.
you mentioned that they are handmade, and I can tell, having handled the machine-built, mass-produced screws, they're made of metal, but they're almost flimsy. It's hard to describe, but these ones, they almost look like a bullet casing because of how the finish on them.
Okay.
Not to say that I have touched the work, because I would never do that in an art gallery.
No, well, you can.
But I can see that quality is there to them. There is...
Well, also, it's really important for me that the screws are actually inserted into the wall absolutely parallel. You know,
Yes.
that they are aligned in both ends. And it's a very hard thing to do. And the last time I made a piece, another setting out iteration was in London with a young curator called Lawrence Lehman, and he built a wall specially for the work. It's the most beautifully built wall I've ever seen in my life. But it was it was made of, what do you call it, that board with plaster in the middle, plasterboard.
Oh, yeah.
So every time you put these screws into a different type of material, they have their own life, you know, and where you're putting them into whatever you're putting them also has its own resistance, if you like.
Yeah.
So I'm very interested in that. And I think there's something about the lack of craft in assemblage work. You know, the work is not about the craft of making clay, you know, three-dimensional works or painting, whatever. It is about the craft is in the way in which the materials are brought together to produce meaning. But also within that is a recognition of the labor that goes into the manufacturing of a lot of these materials. And hidden labor is something very interesting to me. And so therefore, for those screws to be something that are lovingly made for a purpose, for a function, that are now machine made for, they say for price, but they're not cheaper. They mass produce are not cheaper. There's a whole, within that small element within the work, there is a lot to think about.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because Luca's come in and talked about his past employment at Wix, and you talk about craft, and I think a lot of people coming to see your show will recognise these rather ordinary materials but have a particular relationship to them, and people who are builders will think, oh, I know that, and they will be able to see something which is familiar to them but recognise something else has been done to it, and maybe they will get to re-experience or experience for the first time ever something different about these materials that they might be handling all the time.
Yes, I would hope so.
Yeah.
I mean, if that happens, that's great. I remember in Derry when I was making the work, a work called Shelter, which involved all the materials for building an emergency piece of a building in an emergency situation. I remember, and I had a list, an inventory of all the materials, a bit like list for area, but much more detailed. So every screw, every panel, everything was listed. And there were people coming in from the city of Derry looking at this list and discussing would it work, you know, and building their sheds or whatever. But coming with an experience, a skill, a knowledge, a life knowledge to the work. Now, if then that is a way into the work, and then there's a standing back, and I think about why has she put it like that? Why is the string knotted in that way around that screw? What is it saying?
Yes.
That's when it becomes challenging.
Yes, it's interesting how people may bring their lives to your show and then do, as you say, step back and think, but where's the artfulness here?
Yeah.
And then these other sort of thoughts may emerge. And do you have another question for us at all that we could possibly answer?
Well, you didn't tell me which work that you worked
Well,
at.
you can't get out of it.
Okay.
So I'm still waiting for that.
So, in terms of the work that sort of catches my eye, I'm going to be slightly vague and say the work that is on show starts to sort of encourages me to look around the work. I start noticing the dust on the floor, the polyfiller that has been put up or scraped over by some of our gallery technicians, the way some of the tape that is on your work, some parts start to curl at the edge. And I think, is that because of the heating in the room? And then you look at certain parts affected by the light. There's this wonderful ruby red piece of tape. And so you start noticing all these other things that you've never noticed before. And then you come back to the work and you think, oh yeah, I'm here in an exhibition.
Yeah.
So I think it has a really great quality, or it has a really great way of making you look outside of what you're seeing. So when you go home, perhaps you're in your flat or in your home, and you start maybe looking at your plug sockets, or you start looking at the threads on your bed sheet, something like that.
Okay, good, thank you. Well, you wanted to know my next question, and you've more or less kind of answered it, because I was going to ask, what do you think about when viewing the exhibition, and what you've just said about the work is really about the exhibition. It's about the affect of experiencing this work as a body of work. But I'm kind of interested, are there other things that you think about when viewing it?
What I think about first off is beauty, and the beauty of everyday materials. And I normally think that something like a diamond is incredibly beautiful and incredibly complex. And when you compare something like a diamond to, say, polystyrene, normally we might think, oh, there's no comparison. But when you really look into polystyrene, it is almost as complex as crystal formations. And the tape, as I'd said a bit earlier, can have a shine as bright as a jewel. And I think as well, the work makes me think just how playful we can be and create something out of nothing. And I look at your work on our stairwell, which is a brilliant map made from self-drill screws and index tags, and you've got this wonderful poetic publication that comes alongside it. And I think, wow, this person has created completely from their own imagination this system that cannot be found out there in the world, but you've created it. It doesn't come from, at least in my view, doesn't come from mathematics or geometry, but it's something you've played with and you've made, and we can all be inspired by that and maybe come up with our own systems.
Great, thank you.
Well, as I've mentioned, it's hard for me to break away from my history at Wix, only because I spent 2 years working in that store, unloading the deliveries, putting out the installation board.
It's definitely had effect on you, Luke.
It really is. It's like a trauma.
Okay.
So I guess, I think of, for me, I see first the material, not the art.
Yeah.
So I guess in a way, the materials themselves, they are constructed in layers in some of the works. But for me, I start at layer one, which is my own lived experience. Which I'm sure we all do to some degree without necessarily realizing. So I guess I'm just reminded of all the times where someone would come to the till and it was like the first time they've ever dealt with a large sheet of insulation board.
Yes.
And they'd pay for it. They're really excited. They're going home to do whatever it is that they're going to do. And they walk outside, the automatic doors open, and there's a big old gust of wind, and the sheet snaps in two immediately.
Yes.
And it's almost funny. There's almost a comical nature in your work that only lives within me, really.
Of course.
At least when I see the work.
Well, the work lag that's there, that's the stack on its side of some grid board.
That work,
installation board.
I've made note of that work specifically.
Yeah,
that makes me
I
think
saw that stack. I saw a stack like that of those particular boards in King's Cross one day many years ago, and I took a photograph of it because the way that the material that has the grid pattern on it overlaps the edge of the polystyrene created this kind of wave formation and a really quite beautiful and unexpected visual symmetry, if you like, and visual interruption to daily life because it was poetic, I guess.
Yeah. And
it just intrigued me, and so I took the photograph, and then I decided I would make a piece of work to, in a way, honor this, the aesthetic value of this very ordinary, everyday building material. Could I find that building material? I couldn't find it anywhere. I eventually tracked it down to Jersey, where it was manufactured, and it actually was it was sent to me from Southampton in the end. It came to a depot in Southampton, so there's a little link there. It's not made anymore, you can't get it. And I very stupidly thought it would be there forever. And so my first iteration of it, you'll see, is much wider than what we have here, because I use some of the boards to make some of the other work that you'll see on the floor,
I see.
not thinking that I would never be able to get it back.
Oh, no.
So there's something about seeing something in the everyday, in the just ordinary, that then just has within it something that is disrupting, if you like, a knowledge like you have about the material, or an aesthetic appreciation that you have about it, that does something. And so I don't go around hunting for things like that particularly, but when they come across my vision, then I'll certainly try and work with them. And
So, Anne, to finish this episode, we've got for you some questions sent in from the general public.
Okay.
And, of course, just to make things interesting, we've got them in a bowl, and you will be able to pick from random. So let's see how many you get through. Here we go.
Okay.
I'm going to jostle them for you.
Right, okay, go for it.
Lots of jostling going on.
Lucky dip for
Yes,
you.
thank you very much. Here we go. It's like Christmas cracker stuff. Is it going to be like a joke?
Oh, I don't know.
Okay.
well.
Hopefully not.
How do you decide which architectural environmental features to include on your map and why? And this comes from Mark. I presume he means the outermost.
I believe so.
Outermost work. The decision about where to stop on a walk like that is when something disrupts in a way I've just described, something that is just that little bit. It's not ordinary. It's extraordinary. So it's something that I'm not quite sure I know why it's extraordinary when I look at it.
It speaks to you.
But it does. And when I look at it a little bit more carefully, I will discover whether it is actually something that I have, seen and thought about before or not. And if it isn't, then that makes the first cut. And so it could be, for example, two houses built together on a 50s estate on the edge of the city, where the front doors are painted, both are painted white, but one is slightly off-white and the other is a pure white. And I just think that is where you see an example of where two people have made a decision about what they want for their homes.
Yeah.
So that agency, it's about really where people are doing things that, in a sense, are saying, this is an expression or an articulation of a thought I have or something I want to do in the world, and it may be as small as keeping my rusty gate or putting a bit of eco something, solar panels on the roof, or it may be that there's a strip of grass that hasn't been cut for a long time, or it may be a lawn that's immaculately cut. And all of these small nuances that make together the kaleidoscope of our lived environment are the things that I don't decide before I look at what is going to be included, but I do make a slight edit beyond where, so I stop, I look, I take a photograph. That is probably going to end up in the work, but then I may have 20 of these, and 3 of them are rather similar, repeating a similar theme, and I will edit it down to 1, so that then you will have, as you see here, the categories are spread, so that you have a kind of holistic view of a place, and there's enough variant within it to give you a kind of overview of what a particular estate might be like.
That's wonderful.
God, lovely. That makes me think about so many different things in the world.
Just seeing the front door colour.
Yeah.
Things like that.
Goes to, it says so much about everything, I'd say.
Yeah, I think this work is then when I categorize things in relation to garden, for example, it draws attention to the fact that in these places, gardens mean different things to different people.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And gardens are allowed to be gardens by the council in some places and not allowed to be gardens by the council in others. So there's a kind of politics that comes into that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, especially in these communal ones. I've lived in a place with a communal garden in the past, but I see no one in them ever.
Well, I live on an estate that has a communal garden, and just 2 weekends ago, myself and 2 other people who live in the block went to clear away the drug paraphernalia from from the ground of the garden, little garden, and we cut down the old dead wood of things and spruced it up. It's remained pretty good, but it really, at the end of the day, it's this sort of strange balance between what you think you can do if you live on a social housing estate and what you can do, and how do you navigate the council, for example, or the expectations. This is very problematic.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Very interesting.
And that navigation is rife in your work. How do you navigate through the work, and then how that makes you think when you leave the exhibition, how am I going to navigate all these spaces that have been, well, perhaps not freely given, but given to us?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Anne, here we
Another
go.
one? Okay, let's go.
Let me jostle.
Okay, let's see what this one is. Which 3 words would best describe what you want to express in this exhibition?
Ooh.
And that's from Layla. Okay. That's 4 words. Okay. Politics of space.
Oh. What was the potential for the 4th word there?
The.
Oh, okay.
Oh, we didn't need that.
Very, very precise.
I like that.
And would you like to pick one more question from
sure.
our audience?
Very happy to.
And I'm going to not jostle as well, but yeah, go for it, Anne.
Okay, let's
Thank you.
Wow, this is a long one. With your background and interest in performance art, have you ever filmed any of your installations and included them as part of the exhibition, Anon? Yes, absolutely. I have indeed. I have in the past worked with another artist called John Seth. We have a collaborative practice called Work Seth Tallentire, and quite a lot of our work together involved performative actions that are then videoed and appear within the installation as part of the finished work. But also in other work that I've done, such as a piece called The Gap of Two Birds many years ago, I filmed my feet walking over a mountain in the west of Ireland, and that then became a video which is part of an installation, but it also exists as a freestanding film video in its own right. So yes, I have indeed, but it's not filming. This question says, have you ever filmed any of your installations and included them as part of the exhibition, which is a different thing. And I wouldn't say that I have done that, but it's a great idea.
There you go. You can take that one with you.
I'll have that one.
Yeah, that's great. Audience and artists coming together and,
Yeah.
well, giving each other
I'll take that.
ideas.
Yeah, thank you.
Anne, thank you very, very much.
Pleasure.
This is the first of many in this series on the gallery floor, and it truly is an honour to have you here for our very first episode. So thank you very much for taking part.
It's a pleasure.
And I hope you enjoyed yourself. Thank you very much for listening, and we will meet you on the gallery floor next time.